Hi, David Vizard here, and you, my friends, are about to watch PowerTec 10. This edition of PowerTec 10 is all about something a little new on big block Chevys. However, it is based on strategies that are developed from well-known characteristics of the big block. And that's often something that people don't do. They just tackle it in the same old way. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to show how using out-of-the-box parts, this is not a cheap engine, but it's nonetheless out-of-the-box parts to build over 1,000 horsepower from a street driver. And I'm qualifying a street driver as something that you can legitimately drive on the street from 2,000 to 7,000 RPM. Also, I'm legitimizing the calling of this a street build because the idle speed is what you typically get in a street motor, i.e. about 800 to 850 RPM. And I don't know if you're going to like this, but you can always spoil the idling. It idles almost without a noticeable lope. But we're going to tackle the job in a very different way to normal. Now, the one thing that we didn't do is actually finish it off and show you the end results. And the reason for that was pressing work either way. However, you can look up test results of the part we left out and see that what we're telling you here is right on the money. You'll see that towards the end. So let's get cracking here and see what it is this engine we're doing. It's a 632-inch big block Chevy, and here's where it's different. Now, I've said this before many times, but I'm not going to hesitate to say it again. It needs to really sink in. Now, do yourself a favor and read this carefully and let it sink in. If it doesn't do that, read it again, and then we're going to follow it up with a little bit of math just down the road here to prove my point. It's going to be undervalved. That is, not enough valve area to make the best of the displacement. But they look like they've got pretty big valves, so how can I justify this? All you've got to do is work out the area of the valve and see how much area there is per cubic inch. Now, I've had people say, don't be ridiculous, big block Chevy's got plenty big valves. Unfortunately, your eyes are not calibrated in square inches per cube. In fact, most people's eyes are very poorly calibrated. What they initially see is what they expect to see, not necessarily what's there. I'm not going to go into that subject, but that's something that I would like to talk about, because you get people say, well, I've seen it with my own eyes. You know, here's the thing. Eyewitnesses are one of the worst sources of information because they're almost always wrong. They end up seeing what they think they ought to have seen, not necessarily what's there. And I'll qualify that sometime in a separate video. But for now, let's see how we can get around this obvious deficiency of the big block. Now, a long time back, I remember reading a quote, and I think it was Dyno Don Nicholson, and this was back sometime, probably around about 65-ish, 1965, maybe not as late as 1970, but in that era. And what this person, which I think was Dyno Don Nicholson, said, if the engine doesn't breathe in very well. You best compress the heck out of what you do have. That is a very good summation of the situation we have with the big block. Now, you might get people say, well look, we've seen over 100% volumetric efficiency. My answer to that is, I don't give a damn. Let's see if you can make that volumetric efficiency at the kind of RPM we'll say a 2-litre 4-valve engine can make it. That's still undervalved, and it will show way more horsepower per cube than you see from your big block. The only thing that a big block's going for it is it's big. I think the first thing we should do here is mathematically quantify just how much undervalved a big block Chevy can be. Now remember, we're basing this on the square inches, the area per cube of a small block, which isn't exactly the best breathing engine. So let's consider the big block and see if we have the same area per cube, what it comes out like. And this following chart gives you just that data. And here it is. Now, if you think that's bad enough, things get worse from here. For all of its fancy valve angles and things like this, a regular 24-degree big block Chevy head has a port which is not as good as a regular 350 Chevy. So all of those valve sizes that are quoted for the big block, and that's everything from 454 up, need to actually be bigger than they are there. You can most certainly figure that they need to be at least 1/10 of an inch bigger at the small end of the scale. That is, the 2.3 needs to be about 2.4, and at the other end of the scale, the 2.714 valve needs to be near about 2.85. Well, we're never going to get valves in that size. So what can we do to compensate? That's the point here. Now, it would be a mistake to leave you thinking that the valve area per cube of a big block is our only problem. Far from it. Here's another problem that comes up. The bigger the cubic inches get for a given valve size, the tighter the lobe centerline angle needs to be. In other words, we need to look at lobe centerline angles way tighter than the typical 110, 112, 114 you're dished out for a big block Chevy. Now let me say what the situation is here. If we had a regular 10.5 to 1 632, the optimum lobe centerline angle for a 2.3 intake valve and a 1.94 exhaust is about somewhere around 102. Just try buying a 102 lobe centerline cam for a big block Chevy. You'll have to get a blank made. You're looking at a $1,500 cam, absolute minimum. Now, people just throw in cams without giving any thought as to what lobe centerline angle they should be on. They just assume, for the most part, that the cam grinder knows what they're doing. No. Sad mistake. If the cam grinders knew what they were doing, they'd have plenty of blanks able to grind these tight lobe centerline angles that are needed to make the best torque and horsepower. So there's living proof right there that your typical cam company doesn't have a knowledge of what's going on with your typical big block Chevy. Of course, it's a relatively new engine. It's only been around, 50 years. I guess some people are just slow on learning. But if we put the compression ratio up, the optimum lobe centerline angle spreads. That's damnably handy, isn't it? Now, we might be able to get a cam. If we're running 13.5 to 1, we might be able to get a cam that's much nearer what's needed. We'll check into that later. That means that we don't have to have such big cutouts in the pistons. Another good feature. What else? Yes, and here's something that we're not exploiting. We'd like to, but we'd have to get a lot of cooperation from cylinder head companies to do this. If we ran a 13.2 to 1 compression, we don't need to have as big an exhaust valve, and that immediately frees up space for a bigger intake valve. Well, we haven't gone that route because we were officially testing this AFR pair of off-the-shelf cylinder heads. Now, if for 13.2 to 1 compression, we could drop the exhaust valve by at least 1/10 of an inch and increase the intake valve by the same amount, we'd have the same valve situation using up all the chamber diameter. So that would be good, but let's sidestep that for the moment. Let's go on with this compression ratio thing. If we're using a very high compression ratio, one of the benefits we get from that is that we utilize the fuel more effectively. Why? Because our expansion ratio is higher. The critical thing with the compression ratio is not actually the compression ratio, it's the resultant expansion ratio. What that means is the fuel is the burn is acting on the piston for a greater proportion of the stroke. Hence, we get more miles per gallon and more horsepower. So that's a good thing. Now let's see what we have to do in the way of a camshaft. We've got to have a duration which maximizes our dynamic compression, which is going to mean we're going to have at least a 9 to 1 dynamic compression, at least. That's going to mean more octane. We got to look and see how we're going to get that octane as a separate issue for the moment. All our tests here are going to be done with VP fuel, which I believe was 105 octane.
Hello, I'm Terry Walters. In conjunction with David Vizard and myself, we have developed this 632-inch big block Chevrolet. It makes over 1,000 horsepower and idles at 850 RPMs, but it can be run on pump gas, although this engine is 13.5. David will tell you how.
Okay, so I was going to tell you what was put into this engine. As you can probably see or even suspect from the shots I've just shown you, it does have a dry sump system. It's got a scat 4 3/4 stroke crank, scat rods, CP pistons. The main deal though is the cylinder heads. These are, and I will put the part number for it, they have AFR ones. They'll be down at the bottom here. Now, like I said, basically this was a test to see if out of the box CNC ported AFR heads could make 1,000 horsepower. Well, let me tell you, they went right by that, no problem at all. Right, so let's take a look at what we've all done here and the purpose of it, and I'll go through that again. Terry briefly touched on it, but I'll go through it again now. Well, here I am at Terry's place, and hopefully we've just finalized the dyno testing on this. Terry has been doing the development work on this 632 big block for a long time. Essentially, he's taken a different angle to getting street horsepower. instead of having a big cam and a street compression, he's got big compression and a more streetable camshaft. Now the goal was to make over 1,000 horsepower and make really good torque numbers. That was achieved. Now let's see what we've got on this. Essentially, the test here was also to see if it could be done without going to exotic parts, and this basically is a CNC AFR head. AFR are well known for the function of their heads. This here is a top of the line street head or an entry level race head. Stock 24-degree stuff. We're using a profiler manifold, which I've said many times before is the best intake manifold you can get from here. 632 inches. Now where we went a little different was, instead of using a lot of camshaft, we used a lot of compression. Result, this engine would idle at 870 RPM. Horsepower wise, well over 1,000 horsepower. First of all, here's our peak power. You will notice that it hung on for probably nearly 800 RPM without leveling out too much. That turned out to be 1,020 horsepower. As far as torque was concerned, this motor fell just shy of the 900 foot-pound mark. However, I want you to note that even down as far as 2,000 RPM, it was cranking out somewhere around 425 foot-pounds of torque. That indicates great streetability. Let me explain what those two red lines are all about. Terry's dyno is set up either to test diesel engines or race engines. And what we were trying to do here is test a very wide range of RPM. A bigger range than the dyno normally accepts comfortably. So, to get a decent curve at the top end, our accurate figures of torque and horsepower, it was necessary to set the dyno to capture those data points at those higher RPMs. The consequence of this is that the lower RPMs between those two red lines are not particularly accurate. All the readings we did would typically fall between those two red lines. Consistency was not the name of the game. So take it for what it's worth. The worst it could be is the lower red line, the best it could be is the higher red line, and the blue line represents somewhere about average. So it appears we have a slight dilemma here with fuel. I don't know if you've checked recently how much race fuel cost, but it's easy to blow 20 bucks a gallon on it. Not exactly practical for an engine that you would like to be able to cruise on the street with, as well as go fast down the drag strip. Now the way to get around this is to use a cheaper alternative. The next cheapest down alternative is to run with E85. This has a high octane rating. You'll use more of it. You'll only do about 2/3 of the miles per gallon that you would have done, maybe as little as half, but at least it's somewhat practical and affordable. Of course, the other option, and I've been touting this now pretty heavily in PowerTec 10 series, is to water inject the engine. I've done a water injection video, and I'll put the episode along the bottom here, and this engine is ideal for it. But let's look and see how well we did on this, and I want to do a comparison between the engine that Terry and I did with an engine done by Prestige Motorsport, who are in Concord, which is a short way from Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, I know the guys down there pretty well, and their chief engine builder was a very successful NASCAR engine builder. When I say very successful, I mean very successful. So if we use an engine that he built as comparison, we are making our comparison with a top-of-the-line engine. Now, if you want to go and check this engine out, a friend of mine from the past, Jeff Honeycutt, did a very good video on it, which came out only a few days before this one's come out. So check it. I'll put the title down here. Now, when they ran their engine, which was less compression, more cam, although it was still a lot of compression, it wasn't exactly a streetable 93 octane engine. It required a bump up in octane, but it was comparable. That made very similar power curves on race gas. Now, when they swapped it over to E85, and this is where E85 is not used properly in many cases, these guys did it right, which of course I'd expect from their guy. They used a compression ratio suitable to get much more of the potential out of E85. As a consequence, when they plugged in E85 on it, they picked up somewhere around about 80 or 90 horsepower, bringing their engine to 1,006 horsepower. Again, if you watch the video, you'll see the curves. Now, let's look at the water injection. If you investigate some of the water injection videos out there, and for the life of me I can't remember where I saw them, but when I was researching my water injection video, they were all over the place, but you can find them. Typically on an engine around about 800 horsepower, it would appear, if you've got a high compression engine, putting on water injection nets between 30 and 40 horsepower and 30 or 40 foot-pounds of torque, right? That would bring our engine up to somewhere around 1,060, 1,070 horsepower with street drivability, and you could run it on 87 octane, as you could Prestige Motorsports one. Theirs is also a water injection friendly engine. They happened not to do it because they went the E85 route. We should have done that before we finished our testing, but like I said, pressing issues with industrial work at Terry's shop precluded the time on it. So take it for what it's worth. This engine here, with the simple addition of a $400 or so water injection system, deliver about 1,060 horsepower and about 930 foot-pounds of torque on 87 octane fuel. So that's where we got to on our big block. We are going to investigate this route more so in the future and make more use of water injection. Like I said in my water injection video, water injection is the coming thing. If you don't latch onto it, you're losing out. Now, let me also make one other point clear. High compressions are very conducive to good gas mileage. So, a big block done to these specs won't consume as much fuel as you might think. It won't exactly be a small block, but it will be a damnably economical big block. Now, I hope you've got all that and taken it in stock, because that's where we're going to finish up on this edition for today. So, if you liked what you heard, I want you to do two things. Go and check out the Prestige Motorsports engine, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.